So Joni Baboci is here. He's coming from Albania. Actually, he used to run a startup founded by the government, which is pretty unusual situation in a way. But Atelier Albania, as many of us living in Montenegro know it, was very important in Albania to kind of bring up the architectural scene and move and initiate the processes in Albania that kind of started this new way of urban development and architecture. And it was extremely successful. It still exists. Although Joni is not there anymore, he is now the head of the urban planning department in Tirana. And we kind of try to collaborate on some projects, but we also kind of look up to each other in these processes. Especially important in these countries, these moments where you need really some kind of special force to start new development in urban planning and architecture. So, come on.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you everyone for being here and for taking the time to listen to us. It's a great event. I want to thank Diana for organizing it and for making this happen for us. I actually know I'm at home. I know I'm in the Balkans, because in all of the computers in the events in the Balkans, we have this writing here, activate Windows. And that's how we also approach architecture, planning, and most of these other things we're talking about. So I really feel at home here in Kotor. I think it's a fantastic venue to have such an event. I had the pleasure of being here 2 years ago, just for 2 hours, listening to a lecture inside a prison, and then I had to go back to Tirana. It's just 4 hours away from here driving. So I want to talk about, generally about some things that are going on in Tirana. Some of them have to do with reuse, some of them have to do with, most of them have to do with planning actually, not with architecture, not with specific projects. I'm not actually presenting any personal work, unfortunately, because most of the work that I do for the last 3 or 4 years is managing the work of other people. So I'm going to show their work and hope that I sort of try to illustrate what's been going on in the region in the past couple of years. I want to give you some context about the city, about Tirana, and then I want to speak about our approach to planning. We have just started, actually we're kind of finishing, and that's also the idea of the name, urgency in planning. I just said we have just started and then we're just finishing. We had 6 months to do a new plan for the city of Tirana, a city of 1 million, which just grew 25 in its territory, so it's 25 times larger. And so, and then I also want to talk about a bit about our work at Atelier Albania, which was this sort of government office which organized competitions and also research and different sort of activities in the city. And then talk a bit very shortly about our new plan for the city of Tirana. So Tirana came from a long history of total planning. Of course, we were also communist until the 90s, so it was unheard of to have any sort of development which wasn't controlled or planned by the central government. Movement also within cities was restricted, so you had to have a pass or a permit to move from a city to another city, even for traveling, let alone for living or for working there. And therefore, what happened after the 90s was very sudden and very unexpected for most of the people. A lot of people who couldn't and who had never been to Tirana moved from the periphery and from other cities to the center. And this happened heavily between the years 90 and 96, when this thing was allowed. But what happened though afterwards was in 96 we had those pyramidal schemes. So capitalism for Albanians became this fantastic thing. We were one of the, if you saw the European media at the time, or the Western media at the time, we were the best symbol of shock therapy in terms of economic development. So we were held up as this amazing example of how a communist country could become a free market capitalist country in just a couple of years. And of course, most of it wasn't actually reflecting what was happening on the ground. The problem we were having at the ground was that we thought, because of the previous 50 years of communism, we thought that capitalism was freedom, was this fantastic and easy way to be rich and enjoy life. So these schemes popped up, which you just had to invest a very short amount of, a small amount of money, and they would pay a big percentage every month, continuously forever. Of course, they collapsed at some point. And that was the point where pretty much most of this happened. That was the point where people lost control in the system. They lost control in government, in local government, in central government, in banks. And the only way for them to invest or to preserve their capital was to build something physical they could protect with the Kalashnikov. So if you could build your house and you could be on top of it and no one could take it away from you. And this is the result. So people just invaded the city and they built homes, single-family homes in all of the, let's say, agriculture areas around the central capital. Of course, it's a different idea of informality. It's a different sort of concept of informality. Most of those villas are very, very expensive places. They're 2- or 3-story big homes. They're not like small shacks. But it is the same concept in a way. There is actually, if you're interested in this topic, there is a very interesting exhibition going on in Tirana until October at the National Gallery of Arts. It looks at the history of planning in Albania from the year 500 before Christ to the current days, actually 2030, whereas the new national plan is taking us. This is just a very short information for the people who live in Kotor and Montenegro and would want to visit. So basically, this was the sprawl that happened in Tirana in the first 17 years of the post-communist period. You can see the central city was there in the 1990s, and then it sort of enlarged and grew and sprawled around in the first 17 years of this new system. So the population quintupled in the last 25 years. We are now 1 million people. It's a huge city. We just had a territorial reform where let's say the territory which we manage at the municipality was enlarged. It's now 25 times larger. So the population didn't grow by a lot, but the territory to manage is much bigger. So that means that there's a lot of different typologies and different environments in which to plan. Of course, I talked a lot about this idea of the peri-urban informality, but within these first, let's say, 10 or 15 years after the collapse of the system, informality was everywhere. And I think it's interesting to note that one of the reasons why this happened wasn't only because people wanted to build without a permit, it was because it was very hard to get a permit. Corruption and all the stress of the bureaucracy to actually get a permit to build a house, it was much easier to just go there and do it yourself, and cheaper. We also had, though, something very interesting, which is urban informality. So this is a neighborhood I lived in for most of my life. It's called the Partizan block. So, of course, it was a block built by the communists. It was a perfectly planned communist neighborhood with 5-story buildings and with interesting public spaces in between. And then immediately after the 90s, people started to do their own additions to the building. So if you look at it into a plan, it's this sort of repetition of the same building. But then people decided to just reconceptualize their living quarters or offices as they saw fit. So this is actually my apartment and office at one of the other floors, or used to be. This is how it looked before the additions. I was lucky to live on the lefternmost part of the building. And that meant that when this addition happened, this was very disorganized. It was just done by people themselves. Actually, people paid for the structure first, so the structure went up, and then each of the floors decided when they wanted to close their own enclosure. So basically, it's interesting how it also impacted let's say the net worth of people living in the neighborhood. Some people who were able to organize their neighbors and to actually build this have double the real estate, let's say, space that they had. And then some other people on the other side, this is actually how it looks today. On the other side of the building, they just couldn't do it at the time, and now they're stuck because now they can't do it. Now it's you have to get a permit. It's very hard to get a permit. It's a private, actually, space, so they can't do it anymore. So this also changed, let's say, in a way, the physiognomy also of the spaces. So you can see how it looked before the additions, and one of the floors was turned into my father's office, who's also an architect, and he lived on the 3rd floor and worked on the 2nd floor. So it also changed the way that these old communist buildings were being used. This happened all around town. So most of the old neighborhoods sort of went through this sort of development. And I think the result is very, very interesting. So what we see today in Tirana is that this sort of informality, although in a lot of cases it has brought problems in terms of accessibility, in terms of the width of the roads, in terms of fire risk, etc., which of course are very important. It has also created very, very interesting neighborhoods, very active neighborhoods. This has now become one of the prime spots for students to move in when they come from other cities to live in Tirana, because it's cheaper, it has a lot of services in the first floors, so it has produced interesting results in the city. So our approach to planning is that we always work in the Balkans, I would say, but especially in Albania, under this constant state of urgency. So we said, you know, you have 2 months to finish this, you have 3 months to finish this. The time scale is very, very shortened. Usually this limit, funnily enough, is always extended to a normal limit, so to the way that people would do it in Western Europe. But this, you don't know this until the end of the thing. So if you could actually organize it, you would actually have a proper process, but because we live in this part of the world, we have to sort of approach this differently. So what we do in planning is that we can't say, okay, we're going to stop all development, we're going to stop everything we're doing until we have a proper plan, and then we're going to start. But we have to act while we do the plan. So these are some points that we have used in the last year, since the new mayor became the mayor of Tirana, and since I started working at the municipality, to try and bring some changes into the urban fabric of the city. It's about acting through no-regret interventions, so getting some things done which will clearly not bring you any regrets into the future after you have a plan. It's acting through light, quick, and cheap interventions. It's a well-known policy of this project for public spaces in New York about how software can actually reuse and reconceptualize space. It's about inspiring creativity, so just creating the right conditions for the city and for the citizens to actually invent themselves and create the city in a way. It's about solving the obvious problems first, so those problems which are obvious and which clearly need to be solved, you can actually go and address them without waiting for a full regulatory plan to be finished. And it's about practicing smart and up-to-date policies. So of course the prime approach when you work in a government bureaucracy is, okay, we've done this like this for 25 years, so why do we have to do it any differently? It's worked pretty well, but that's not always the case. I'll go through a series of projects which sort of show this action. This is about, for example, reusing and readapting a space into a parking lot. It doesn't look like an interesting project, but on the other hand, the municipality was making 7,000 euros a year from parking, and just this intervention now it's making, just out of this intervention, is making 70,000 a month, which is a great source of income for the country. This money was being paid to individuals who were just going there and informally getting money, and they were telling people, if you don't pay me, I will scratch your car. So we just sort of formalized this system, and we got some more money for the institution. This is another intervention which we maybe will talk a bit about also later. Tirana has had this plan of, I mean, it has 4 concentric rings, or 5 concentric important rings into the urban, let's say, scheme of the city. And one of them, the small ring road, was planned in the old year 1913. It was planned then, it was worked for continuously the past 113 years, and finally we're sort of going to a close. We're finishing the last 100 meters. It's a total of 2 kilometers of road, but finally we're finalizing it. But of course, it's a no-regret intervention. If it's been in the plan for 113 years, pretty much you can be sure that it will be in the next plan as well. One idea also is that our approach to planning has been to try and reuse the existing infrastructure. So in most of the interventions we've done in street infrastructure, we haven't actually enlarged or increased the width of the street, because that means a lot of expropriation, lots of problems with private, let's say, space at the corner. But we have tried to reimagine the same amount of space with a different approach to mobility and to movement. Of course, by creating dedicated bus lanes and dedicated bike lanes. These are just a couple of the interventions of the last year. One interesting thing, which I also I really enjoyed at the Cosmos presentation, was also this idea of software into cities. So how can you actually, without any sort of infrastructural intervention or without any sort of money, how can you do some interesting you can create some interesting situations in the city? And one thing that we now do every week is a car-free day in Tirana. So most of the center of Tirana, we have a big plan there to have a big pedestrian square, but until we get there, we just close off the whole center for one day, every Sunday, and then people can just use it however they see fit. In the beginning, everyone was complaining, but look at the traffic, look at what's happening with the cars, you're blocking it off. But we realized that this was just a very, very loud minority. About 20% of the people in Tirana own a car, the rest don't, and the rest actually really like the new space that is created every Sunday. Of course, graffiti is also one of the things. Tirana is well known for for its colored buildings. So it was one way that the mayor of Tirana in 2001, Edi Rama, who is now the prime minister, decided to approach the city. We had this very bleak, gray, post-communist, let's say, atmosphere. And what he said is that, okay, we're going to invite some famous or some up-and-coming artists from Western Europe, and we're going to give them a building, and they're going to be able to paint it. Some of those guys are now pretty famous in the art world. So now we're trying to conserve this and repaint these buildings in the same shape that they were. But of course, this sort of intervention, although it was a very superficial and a very simple and cheap intervention, it really had an impact on the city because it sort of created a different atmosphere. It created a sense of hope, which was, of course, then you needed to fulfill with other sort of interventions, but it worked very well 15 years ago. So we're trying to do something similar now, and what we're seeing is that we're getting most of the art students to do their end of year course, let's say homework or coursework into the city. So we're just giving them spaces, and then that's where they're working on their diplomas or on their work. Another idea is to create these sort of moments in the city. So, for example, you go into a bus. Buses in Tirana are not that nice, and they're cheap, but they're not the best place to be. But then sometimes we just have some random people who play music go into these buses and just create a different sort of atmosphere into this bleak and random situation. And of course, one other thing, again, into this concept of reusing existing space without sort of intervention, without sort of a lot of architecturing or a lot of money, is how to sort of, now that we have this much bigger territory, how to make the urban population and the rural population sort of work and exchange. So the idea is to get people to the countryside more by organizing these market days, and then get marketplaces to the city more in this sort of common exchange of goods, but also of experiences. I'll skip this. This is, of course, we went through, we didn't have a lot of budget in the first year, so we had 31 private contractors who were, of course, they wanted things from the municipality, like most private contractors do in most of the Balkans and most of the world. So we said, okay, at the end of the day, we're pretty sure most of you are going to get what they want, so you might as well get also kindergarten and sort of repair it and make it better. So we had 31 kindergartens just repaired in the first couple of months of work. I think that one other thing which is very, very important in these sort of policies is how to involve people more, especially in this sort of software intervention, in these sort of structural interventions into the city which do not involve infrastructure. So we've been trying to practice a lot of public participation, a lot of discussion with citizens. Sometimes it's very productive, sometimes it's very, very tiring without any sort of real result. But it's a different approach, and it's an interesting approach which again, is different from what things were being done before. So we're trying to experiment with those new things. And on the topic of reuse, we've been seeing a lot of situations where reuse is really, really hard, if not impossible. So in some cases, I think it's important to keep in mind in our discussions and in the future debates that it's important not to glorify this concept of reuse where everything can be reused. Of course, it's an important, I think it's a very important issue, but it's not always the solution. And of course, sometimes it's something that can really, really add up to a city. This is the pyramid. It's one of the. This was designed as the dictators. Let's say Enver Hoxha was a dictator of Albania during the communist period. So a couple of years before he was heading for death, he designed and commissioned this mausoleum for him, where he would his museum would happen. This was completed in '86 or '88. Sorry, 2 years after he died. It served as a museum for 2 years, and then it became a cultural center, but it's still in the current politics, it's still hailed as this communist symbol in the center of the city which needs to be demolished. There was a lot of discussions and debates 6 or 7 years ago where people wanted to build a new parliament here. It was also part of there was a big architecture competition. It was also shown at the Venice Biennale, this new Parliament of Albania in the pyramid. Thankfully, it didn't happen, but it's today in this ruinous state. and we're really thinking really hard what to do with it. One of the collaborators of APSS, actually, Andreas Ruby, had a lecture here, and it was the first time this space was opened 3 or 4 years ago, and since then it has served as a temporary space for events, for lectures, for presentations, for concerts, but its future is still uncertain in terms of how it's going to be used and how what interventions is going to be we're going to do to it. One very interesting concept related to reuse is, of course, the post-communist legacy. So in Albania, we have a lot of communist buildings, like most of the ex-Yugoslavia and most of the East. We have a lot of these interesting spaces designed and built at another time with a very, very different concept of space and architecture. And today that we find that these spaces don't work anymore. So in this image, you can see the National Museum on the top left, and then the Palace of Brigades, or the Palace of the self-proclaimed King of Albania in the 20s in the top right. In the bottom right is the House of Enver Hoxha in the block area. The block area is a fantastic example of reuse. It's a central part of the city of Tirana, and it used to be the residential neighborhood for the cadre of communist, let's say, leadership. So all of them had their private villa. It looks like the one in the bottom right, most of them, which looked very, very luxurious for the time. The whole neighborhood was cordoned off, so you couldn't really go into the neighborhood without a specific permit. And this area is today the party central of the city of Tirana. So most of these villas have been demolished and huge buildings have been built, but some of them have been preserved, and now every interesting nightlife event happens into this area. So it's sort of, the reuse was really extreme in this case, where it went from a very radical, very isolated neighborhood to the most open and most interesting neighborhood that we have today in the city. And then the bottom left is the League of Writers. It's another communist institution. The building is even older. It's from the Italian times, but from the 1920s and 30s. But for all of those 4 buildings, we saw that in the last 10, 15 years, some of them have their functions, some of them have still preserved their functions. So the National Museum, you can still go and visit it today. It's a horrible museum, but you know, it needs to be rethought. The items are very interesting, but the space doesn't work. It's a huge space with very singular small items all around it. So what we thought was that how can we, during the time of Atelier Albania, how can we take these buildings and sort of find a new function for them? So this was an architecture competition which didn't really imply any architecture. The idea was to have some curators for these buildings, which would sort of redefine space without changing them. Most of those, or all of those actually, are monuments of culture. You can't really demolish them or change them or have any extension to them for now. So the idea was, what can we do within the existing skin of these buildings? It has produced some interesting results, so some things are going on. The competition concluded 6 or 7 months ago. 4 different teams were selected, international and local. We had this idea at Atelier Albania since the beginning, where we think that when you hold an architectural competition, just having a foreigner coming into a city they don't know, staying there for a couple of days, and then proposing this majestic solution doesn't work all the time. So what we tried to employ was to have these teams of local and foreign architects who would collaborate together, one team from Albania and one team from wherever in the world. If they couldn't find each other, we would try to coordinate teams, and then they would have a very well-defined and a very well-prepared local context, so they would know the context because the local team would be there to check all the time. But you would also have this international vision coming from a person who has never seen the city of Tirana and who can actually think about some new and very interesting ideas and concepts which, when you live there for decades, you sort of start to miss. Out of the work with Atelier Albania, the final, let's say, research wasn't really on architectural competitions. It was about national and regional planning. So this office dealt with national planning, regional planning, and then it dealt with specific pilot projects to implement what were the sort of findings of planning. So our final research, or the most important research out of that project, which is still ongoing with a different sort of context now, is the metabolism of Albania. It was a collaboration with the International Architectural Biennale of Rotterdam, 51 N4E, and the TU of Delft, where the concept was, how can we sort of look at the country in terms of flows? How can we plan not in terms of just in static terms, in terms of cities and where the population is, but how can we see how goods and how information move through the country? The four sort of maps you see are about water, agriculture, energy, and tourism. So the idea was to analyze those four flows, how energy moves, where it is produced, where it is consumed, how food moves through the country, where it is produced, where it is consumed, and so on. And to try and see what are some of the conflicts and some of the, let's say, synergies into these four concepts. We wanted to extend this to even more flows, but this was a good number for which we had the budget at the time. So the idea is that for each of the flows, we have a Sankey diagram, which sort of explains where the resource comes from in the left hand on the graphic, and where it is consumed, where does it go to in the right side. So this is water, and of course most of the water just goes to evaporation, and it's not a very groundbreaking diagram. This part of the research was also sort of a cross-cut of the country, so from the let's say coast all the way to the mountains in the east, and how does this element move through the territory, how does it go into dams and it produces energy, and then how does it finally cross into the sea. And then this is the map where it sort of, we try to illustrate all the research with all of the specific, let's say, points or specific information that we have gathered. The same thing we do with food. And here it's interesting for the food and for the energy sector to see the import and export. So although we produce a lot of fruits and vegetables, we also import a lot of cereals, a lot of other elements which could be easily produced in the territory. We found out that currently we have just half the arable land that we had in the 1990s. And that's because people, some of the land was used for urban reasons, some of the land was just misused, was not kept, let's say, irrigated and channelized. So we found out that now we're producing, although we were a big exporter of fruits and vegetables before the 90s, now we're an importer of it, just because of this inefficiency in terms of how let's say, the fiscal sector and all of the subvention sector works. The same thing we've done with energy, which I think is very, very interesting. If you see let's say, the red and the yellow, let's say, portions, we produce 43.2 petajoules of crude oil, and then we import 41.2 of oil products. So we sort of export all of our crude oil, and then we import all of the processed, let's say, oil products. So of course it's a typical, let's say, developmental country graphic where you see that most of the actual profit from this resource is being just exported to the country which does the processing and then just sells it back to Albania. And then the same thing we want to do for this, the energy graph, but what was interesting was that the same thing we want to do for tourism. Tourism is a very up-and-coming important resource in the country, so we wanted to see how people would move, what were the main, let's say, resources, the main points where people would go to. And then, of course, all of this work was done with the specific intention of trying to overlay these layers together and see what would be the interesting connection points and what would be the different synergies. So of course, in a lot of points, we would see that the tourism sector was colliding with the energy sector and the agricultural sector, because let's say, this fight for water was very big. Water was coming, the mountains are in the east of Albania, so water was flowing towards the west. And at different points, there were projects for hydroelectric power plants, there were projects for different, let's say, agricultural developments. So we were actually, this really helped us in order to see, okay, in some points it's very easy to go and have some investments in energy because there's no other interest in terms of these other topics, and in some points it's not so. So it was an interesting research, and I think that it sort of served as the basis for what now we call the National Plan of Albania, and a couple of the regional plans which were just passed last year in government and are supposed to help local governments with their plans. And then the last thing I want to talk about briefly is the current plan, which we call TR030, which is the plan of the new Tirana, let's say this enlarged Tirana. It deals a lot with reuse in terms of urban redevelopment. So what we're missing in the city is a lot of public spaces, open public spaces. We have huge problems with property, and that means that because of the history of the last 25 years, some plots in Tirana have 3 different owners, And in the beginning of the 90s, the government decided to be the guarantor that for all three of those owners in a way. So all three of them sort of have a claim to the land. Some of them will be paid by the governments. One of them will, of course, be the title deed owner. So this means that public space is very hard to get, because even if you want to expropriate, sometimes you have to expropriate more than one owner. So what are some of the main points of this plan that we are working on? First of all is to plan under the pressure of this urgency that we have in terms of development, in terms of interventions, in terms of showing the public some results. The second thing is we are very aware that we have a very short amount of time, and therefore what we thought since the beginning was, okay, we won't have time to plan everything, but let's create a very good framework, a good planning framework where we know what are all the pieces that we need, and then let's focus on those pieces which we think are more urgent, and then let's leave those other pieces open, but let's have a place for them. Let's keep them as a, let's say, a constant reminder of what we have to do. Of course, full inclusion of interest groups and citizens is very important, especially in a politicized society as the ones that we have in the Balkans, especially in Albania. So the politics play a very important role. Every time that a new government comes, they say, okay, the old plan doesn't work, we just cancel it and let's make a new plan. And then after 2 years, we have a new plan and so on. So the concept was, how can we actually involve most of the people who will be let's say, the people who will be against the plan in a couple of years, so they understand it's a good thing. And even if they formally claim that they have changed the plan, they actually will keep the sort of work that has been done. Of course, something that comes from the Atelier Albania work, this idea of international vision and local context, which work together to try and produce a very original but also up-to-date project. And also very important to fight the inertia of the bureaucracy of government. So often it becomes very easy to just go with the flow, to just do whatever was being done up to that point. And we see it a lot with infrastructure projects. As I said, cars, of course, Tirana had 200 cars in the 1990s and had the proper infrastructure for those 200 cars. It worked very well. But then when they became 200,000, it didn't work anymore. And of course, that we don't think that that's a solution. When you see the numbers, we currently have 180 cars per 1,000 inhabitants, while most developed countries, even Greece or Italy, have this in the 400 or 500 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. So that means that the trend would be for us to triple the amount of cars in the city or in the country, which is unfeasible. And therefore, we have thought that one idea to fight this sort of way that things were done before was, how can we encourage and invest into the use of bikes as much as possible, not only in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of creating the proper, let's say, environment, in terms of social policy, in terms of subventions into buying a bike and so on. So I'm just going to show you some of the main, let's say, concept of this new plan I think are interesting in terms of planning, but also in terms of how most of them actually just deal with reimagining the existing features of the landscape. So for example, one of the concepts, the plan is being worked with Stefano Boeri, Architetti from Milan, and then a couple of other teams from Rotterdam, IND and UN Lab. So it's let's say, it's a team of 4 different players, the municipality and then those 3 teams. So some of those ideas maybe you've heard in different projects in different contexts. Another important idea in terms of reuse was, how can we look at the periphery, not in terms of conserving it, or not in terms of just saving it, but how can we have a productive periphery around us, where we actually conserve the actual environment, but at the same time, it has a specific function. So it becomes functional, and therefore it preserves itself because it's functional, not just because the government says you can't use it and you can't develop it. So this is a very important context in what we're working on. I spoke a bit about the ring roads in Tirana. As you can see, those are some of the drawings from the past. Tirana had the plan to have 5 important ring roads for cars since the 1940s. And of course, the small ring road is the one you see there in the yellow, and that one is 113 years old. So the idea was that, how can we look at this? Of course, that some of those ring roads already work, but how can we reimagine some of them? We have 5 of them, so we still leave 3 of them, the 3 main ones, to cars, but then 2 of them, we actually, the 4th ring road and the 2nd ring road, we sort of focus onto bikes, onto pedestrianized areas, public transportation, but also a series of public space around the city. So you don't have to, we have this big we have two big parks, let's say the one you see in the north and one you see in the south. And they have very nice running infrastructure, but if someone who lives in other parts of the city would want to go running, it would be very hard for them to just walk to this park or drive to this park and then... So the idea was, how can we create a couple of actual running tracks which go around the city, in the middle of the city, where someone would just go out of their neighborhood, start running, come back, and it would be much more accessible and much more functional. The main boulevard, let's say, of Tirana is now punctuated with a number of very interesting projects coming from a number of international competitions that we have organized in the past couple of years. I'll just go through some of them. This is the concept for Skanderbeg Square, this pedestrian square I talked about a bit before. And it's from 51 and 4E, a Belgian architecture studio. And the concept is that because Albania is such a dense and such a covered, let's say, space, all of the city is very, very... even if it's not dense as we want it to be, it's the landscape, the territory is covered with walls or small houses or very low dense development. So their concept was to have this big emptiness in the middle of the town to sort of, let's say, contrast all of these other works. This is also a project which was commissioned close to 13 years ago. Hopefully we'll start work next month. The tower you see at the background there is also from 51 and 4E. That took 11 years from the competition to the actual completion a couple of months ago, where they finally opened it. A couple of other interesting projects are the Faith Park, which was won by a Rotterdam company called UN Lab. The idea was to have, Albania is very lucky to have a lot of religious harmony. So although we're a majority Muslim population, we also have a lot of Christian Orthodox, Catholic Christians and Orthodox Christians, and a lot of atheists, because we were in the 60s, the government decided Albania to be the first atheist country by constitution. So there's a lot of different religious beliefs and communities, and the idea was and they coexist very well. It's I think a very interesting example of how people intermarry and don't have this sort of, they don't take religion very seriously in a way. So I think that one of the projects that was proposed 10 years ago was to, again, I speak in decades because that's how much it takes to have an idea and then to get it done, was to have this number of parks throughout the central boulevard where you have different trees and plants from the different faith, let's say, literature, from the Bible, from the Quran, and so on. And you would actually have them identified. So this is the olive which is mentioned into this and this page of the Bible, and this is the date tree that is mentioned in this and that page of the Quran. And then the other important project is the new boulevard project. Just 1 kilometer from the center of town, we have this huge area which has never been developed. It used to be a train station, and then it's punctuated with small houses, but the idea is to redevelop it and create a new huge central park there, a competition won by Grimshaw architects from the UK a couple of years ago. Student City was a competition which was organized last year, I believe, and baukuh won it. So their idea, again, all of these projects I think are interesting, and maybe I'm not mentioning well enough because I also want to get to the part where we debate. And the idea is that all of these projects sort of get an existing infrastructure, mostly with buildings, and try to reimagine it into a new space. Not by simply reusing it. Of course, sometimes you have to add something, sometimes you have to rethink the way it works. But this concept of reuse is always there because of the financial limitations of actually getting something new done in a country with a very small budget. Another one is the Tirana Olympic Park, which again tries to reuse all of the different buildings existing there. And another one is the Tirana Lake Park by Peter Wilson and Atelier 4 architects, where they try to sort of turn the Tirana Lake Park into a sort of Gorky Park, into an urban park, not just a naturally preserved landscape in the city. A very important project in terms of reuse is the polycentric city. The idea was that Tirana has just one center, and that's where most people just sort of gather and go to live, to work, and to play. But it also has a lot of industrial or post-industrial archaeology all around the corner. So you see this, there's this sort of star growth with 4 important axes, and at the end of each axis there's a big factory or a big industrial development from the communist times. So our concept is to try and make competitions out of each of those 4 spots, and try to reimagine them into sort of university pole, startup centers, art residency centers, and so on. So it's an interesting thing to look ahead for all the young architects here to maybe try and participate. One very and last very important concept that we have is that we want to turn schools into community centers. So we have a lot of schools in Tirana, and that's good. We also want to build a lot of new ones, but the problem that we have is that after 11 or 12 p.m., these are dead spaces, and we have a severe lack of space in the city, of public space, of community space. So our concept is to try and transform all of our schools into community centers in the afternoons, places where you can go to have a computer course or to watch a movie or to have a community discussion with your neighbors. So activate those existing spaces, not in terms of infrastructure and not in terms of building and architecture, but in terms of function. So give them a second life, as it may be, after a certain time. I'll end it there, actually. These are not that interesting in terms of reuse and adapt. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for your attention, and looking forward to have a discussion with all of you on those topics.
Maybe the first thing, maybe to start where we ended. Whenever we talk about reusing something, it's automatically implied this sustainability is again one of those words that you can't get it wrong. If you use sustainability, this is something good for sure, right? I mean, I was thinking about the pyramid, which is such a famous landmark or controversial landmark in Tirana. Is there also is there such a thing, not as a not just an environmental sustainability, but also like social sustainability in a way that you don't tear buildings down whenever one regime is ended, and you inhabit the buildings when there is either uprising or just reacquire the space, re-inhabit, reuse the space also politically. Not just we have this situation, let's just use the stones. I'm trying to say that I suppose sustainability is not only environmentalist or architecture concept, but maybe it's mostly social or political. What would you say on that?
I would tend to agree with you. I think that sustainability is an overused term for sure, and it's mostly used in terms of environment, in terms of conservation. But on the other hand, I think that the only way for such a concept to work is for it to be functional. So you can't have sustainability for the sake of sustainability. It has to sort of, that's why I think that in a lot of cases informality is very sustainable. It looks unsustainable, but if you actually find a way to shape it, if you find a way to push towards it, I was showing this idea of polycentrics before. We can't tell people you have to develop there. What we can do is create the right incentives. So now we're lowering tax into those we're diminishing tax to the minimum of development, and we're trying to raise the building intensity so they can build higher and with more volume. So they have an inherent interest to go and do what we want them to do. And I think the same concept has to apply to sustainability. It can be something that you sort of try to force into the profession, into architecture, into planning. It has to have a rational, let's say, a rational sense behind it. It's very rational as a concept, but it's often used irrationally.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. The thing that I always find so appealing with reusing stuff is that I think it signals ability or also willingness of the architects or urban planners or anyone to let go of the total control of the situation. So automatically when you're dealing with things that are already there, you're letting go of the total design or total planning. I think that was also so much present in your project. And I would ask you, how do you feel that does this enable any kind of new freedom in a way that you have pre-existing state of things that you react to? How is that, I mean, how that changes the whole architectural planning, design process?
I think that actually when you start not with zero, not with a scratch, I think maybe you can end up with a much more interesting project. And for example, this pyramid, you can see that it was like imposed on like in an empty space, and that's why it's so dominant, and maybe that's why it's not liked, and it's also has this, I don't know, it's charged politically. But I'm sure if there's a new project on top of it, which is not demolishing it completely, but rethinking it, it will be perceived completely positively. I think the same like with our project of Art-Ufa, which I think also basically the client, he also like he almost wanted to bring architecture to curatorship. Let's say we did some interventions, but we tried not to like demolish it or to build like twice more, or to it was just rethinking how to use the existing structure. And I think it's always like being in this sense contextual always gives something interesting, because you can see basically which problems is architecture solving. It's not just standing there for itself as a full of herself, like egoistically, but it kind of interferes with the existing site.
Yeah, I think as well you can be much more precise actually with your answer, because when you see existing situation and you see the people, the way they behave there, it's much more easier to detect the problem. And sometimes just like following the people, just observing them properly, you can come up with a much more precise solution.
It's not a tabula rasa that you can just project
Exactly.
your hopes or something. Yeah.
It can be completely like missing. Like you can think that it will be great for something, it will be like a poke in the sky in the wrong direction.
I especially liked your act of wrapping the facade with a transparent foil. It reminded me, or at least I immediately connected it to this statement of Le Coton Vasal that I always think of in the square, that they did this huge thing of not doing anything. And it seemed to me that preserving something that's considered universally as a banal mall, a shopping mall, and wrapping it into this completely transparent form means making something similarly radical. In a way, you don't do a thing, but you change the whole concept behind how the building is viewed, not just by you, but by everyone, right? I mean, how would you describe this act?
I think it's just basically like a minimal act which shifts the way how you look at the object. Let's say like if you bring a piece of art to the art gallery, everyone starts looking at it as a Duchamp masterpiece, and the same here. You even saw like a pissoir or like a toilet in front of, like sculpture of a toilet in front of a building. So I don't think aesthetically it was much of a high level, but as soon as you don't kind of snobbishly say, oh, it's so ugly, like we want to demolish it, we want to build something like so beautiful, like we were taught for many years in university, but you kind of accept it and say, okay, let's just, what is the minimum we can do to shift the people's perspective? Let's make this little transparent intervention, and it immediately shifts the way how you perceive this ugliness. And it's not that it becomes more beautiful, but I think becomes more interesting because it adds a different layer, which is not trying to hide the opposite.
Yeah, also it's kind of our understanding of sustainability, because it's not only about not using more materials, also to save up the budget, but because in fact budget is also a very sustainable thing. So we every time trying to work with as less additions as possible, just to add only what's really necessary, and experiment with cheap material which you never assume as a construction material. Like for example, the one we showed in the workshop when you wrap with a black film, which is actually agricultural film. And to us, it's the most interesting to find a new way to make it cheaper, faster, and better.
Would you say that having a very small budget is a two-sided thing? I mean, in one way, often it's having a small budget for the people who are giving you the money, I suppose, means yeah, you have less money, but you can use more creativity. So it can be a cheap way of not giving enough money. But when viewing at it in another time, do you think that truly being more narrowed in financial terms, you have less financial abilities.
It's every time, you know, like the golden middle. You really shouldn't go too crazy, because if you don't have money, finally there's the moment you really cannot do any. But of course the restrictions follow you, forcing you to make more creative solutions, because sometimes when you see building with a really high budget and you see it's really overly done, the details are too expensive, like it shouldn't cost this way, just there was a budget and they really want to show off how much money they have. So that's sometimes not the best way to treat architects.
I think that I think it's very interesting to see this concept of the budget, how it has changed in the last years. It's always a small budget now. It's very hard to get a big budget if you're not a star architect or if you don't have this. But I think that that also reflects in a way how the profession has in a way grown, and it has expanded globally. In this part of the world, and I think you can see this very well in Skopje, for example. A city is the city which sort of you reflect, and you see Rome, you see Paris, you see this regular patterned, very old, nice architecture, big boulevards, and that's what, at least in Albania, that's what you imagine. That's how you want your city to be. That's your, you know, we say you will never be like Paris, will never be like London. Of course, because they were developed in different realities. The amount of capital, budget, and money that was available through the colonies to build those cities is not existing anymore. And architecture is not anymore in the purview of architects in London or in Paris. It's all over the world. And I think therefore it has normalized this extractive and sort of way that this thing worked before into a much more neutral. So an architect from India now can work into, as you guys also perfectly showed, how a team of international architects can work together into a certain context. But that also means, I think, that makes it so that you have to work with, the budgets are always smaller because there's more competition, there's more, let's say, more research to be done and so on.
I really liked these extensions that you showed, extensions that were done by the people themselves in a completely chaotic manner, because usually, of course, this is something that's criticized automatically, and I found it interesting that from the planning level, this is at least acknowledged as being there, and also to a degree looked at with benevolence, so to speak. And it reminds me, and I'm sorry for constantly referring to the Le Carton Vasar, which is a firm that fascinates me with its early projects, but I'm questioning now their practice now. They're basically created in the last 10 years this niche of making the same things as the Albanians were doing by themselves, wrapping the old residential blocks with the outer layer and doing basically what you showed, just in a planned way and generalized way. And why their planning is, or their architectural inventions there are almost universally praised as something that's sustainable to an nth degree and extremely radical and so on. At the same time, there exists still prevalent criticism of basically a bottom-up approach, which is what you were showing, right? It's an interesting dichotomy in the architectural profession of viewing this thing.
I think that the reason why it's sort of viewed also with benevolence in Albania is because we built 400,000 informal developments, informal constructions in the last 20 years. So pretty much everyone built something informally. So if you say that I don't like informality, that means that your own house is at risk, or your own addition is at risk at being... so that's why also there's a sort of benevolence. On the other hand, I think that each approach doesn't work. So you can't have that sort of wild informality forever, because then you would produce something crazy. You have to keep in mind that these additions were done into the land of someone else. So I would go into the land of Diana and say, okay, I'm going to build my home here. You can't do anything because there's 5 of us. So it's not sustainable in that sense. But on the other hand, I think that the other approach also doesn't work. I think that you have to always find a balance. And I think that that's the way to actually have something which is functional, sustainable, and works well for a city.
I think it's a very, also this part of the presentation found particularly interesting, and also that it wasn't like just as usually criticized like directly, but was seen as having a potential. And also in Moscow recently, the government, which increasingly became more, let's say, authoritarian, decided to demolish all illegal commercial buildings in Moscow, and they chose like 144 illegal commercial buildings, which were in all public spaces and served pretty well for the last 20 years. And that actually created such a big debate in the society, which actually like just demolishing these little illegal shops made lots of people to debate over like politics, over philosophy, over like urbanism. And I think that's true that maybe trying to make cities sterile is not the way to go, but also, yeah, like Kowloon walled city cannot function. So therefore, there should be some smart, kind of slightly ironic, but approach which is maybe allowing. Like that's maybe where the debate starts. But I think that I agree that none of the extreme attitudes to these structures can be applied, neither like the sterile totalitarian city nor the kind of favela style. But I think the answer is somewhere in the middle with a very smart approach to each one.
Yeah, maybe we could say that reuse in this sense is a way of learning to letting loose the control from the planners, to letting loose the control from the architects, and to slowly including all kinds of participants in the basically planning process itself. I mean, it's basically reusing implies necessarily also breaking down the boundaries in between you plan, you design, and you just live in it, right? I mean, it's mixing all of the three areas, wouldn't you say? I mean,
I think that it's what we're discussing currently is actually a well-known, I would say, fact for the profession. The Biennale curator sort of illustrates it. So that's sort of the approach that they try to also try to, the Venice Biennale curator, try to attract into that sort of context. So I do agree that with what sort of we're all saying here, we sort of all agree. So we have to find someone who doesn't agree with this sort of approach to have an actual debate.
Well, I mean, that's a question that I had in Venice Biennale, that now we have a situation that practically the whole profession agrees on everything and everyone has good intentions, right? And just the results seem not to be completely in line. I mean, everyone wants the same thing, they want it approximately in the same way, so what's the problem then today in architecture? Because there is, right?
Yeah.
Clients not so often participate in discussion.
Sorry?
Clients not so often participate in discussion, so it's mainly architects' discussion, and we're speaking the same language.
But even within the architects, there may be not the classical criticism, or I mean, you know, thorough criticism in discussion that would be inherent, right?
I got a feeling that actually now everyone feeling that, you know, current state of the architecture, of contemporary architecture, is more or less on dead end, and everyone really searching for a fresh brief. So that's why all these ideas are so welcomed by the society, by the community, I would say.
But basically, maybe like it sounds of course kind of good to praise like participative architecture, sustainable architecture, but it also, I think, maybe we can come up to a point when this will also aesthetically weaken, and let's say we came from the time of star architects and very strong formalism and kind of ego architects to the time of, let's say, collaborative, participative, sustainable social architecture, which also is, as we can see, let's say, formally, is much more subtle. Like, let's say, the Lacaton Vassal projects, they have nothing in common, let's say, with brutalist icons, which are like stars all over the place made of reinforced concrete. So I think there will be I don't know, a next maybe movement will be when, let's say, the contemporary type of architecture will be criticized already, not from social standpoint. Maybe it will reach the amount of perfection needed, and then people will say, but let's do something like ego, let's come back to the crazy formalism. And I think this will be like basically a pendulum will go back to this direction, which will be, I don't know, a different discussion then. That's that's how I can imagine it developing.
Or maybe even more dystophically, that the participatoriness and sustainability becomes ornament, right? I mean, because it's not literally, but it's the role that it plays right now. So you embellish your project, whatever it is, with a bit of participatoriness and a bit of sustainability, whatever that is, because it's a word that can encompass lots of different meanings. So it becomes ornamental, even though it's defined as something that's not formal, right?
It becomes almost like an obligatory spice, which you spice up your architecture, and then it kind of gets validated by the community. But maybe sometimes it's not necessary to use it. Sometimes, so yeah. Like
you said, that it's not always the best idea to reuse, or something it's not sensible to reuse it, which is a healthy reminder in this debate, right?
I think the exotic spice sort of synonym is perfect. So you can't use the same thing for the same concept for all the approaches. I think that the problem is that we talk a lot about these issues, but you see them much less into the actual practice of architecture. So of course it's in the debate now, everyone talks about it, it's important to be sustainable, but sustainability takes this shape that we were discussing in the beginning, where you have to, how can we spend less carbon than what we spent before, and how can that's okay, that's important. No one can say that's not important, but it's not practical in terms of how you approach a project. You can say that this project is going to spend less carbon than this other project. That's not interesting to most people. You could say this is going to be much more functional and it's going to be better to the environment, but then you have to find out how is it more functional. And that, most of the time, that doesn't happen. It's just it's a very formal checking of this sustainability, let's say, icon into the list. But so the debate is different. The practice is also very different in terms of how it's practiced today.
I think it's also about the users, because what's the most interesting current discussion that now all the users are involved in the process. And we're speaking about sustainability. It's not only about design. You design sustainable building. It's also about all the users. They use it sustainable way. So yeah, I think this is the key words for now. So how everyone involved in one process, and everyone have to be very much up for this idea.
I have just a small question about the wall that I found extremely interesting. Also, a rather brave project to make, I suppose, in contemporary Hungarian situation. And I thought that this could be thought of as an object that was built as a ruin, right? I mean, if you build a wall with holes, you basically build a wall after it was partly torn down, or only a wall that's already torn down or not built until its finished stage is a ruin can bring together people, not divide them. Would you say you build a new ruin even before it was the finished wall, or is that?
Yeah, maybe that can be like a symbolical understanding. And yeah, you guessed right. How we started with this kind of line and this Hungarian crisis, because project was there. And maybe, yes, we in a way built, like we even left this, like it was important for a structure to build this kind of, I don't know how to say, like the elements which protrude, that it's not like, although it looks similar maybe to our billboard, but it was very important that the lines continue in space, so it kind of means some kind of movement. But we can also say that this is, let's say this wooden workshop, it goes every year, and we are kind of imagine that this is a ruin which invites for a future interaction. That's why we put it there and marked it symbolically. And we think like, yeah, it's a ruin which is, yeah, maybe it's what you said, but it's kind of the one which invites future actions also.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.